evening, everybody, and some familiar faces. Welcome to another Okanagan Print Triennial Artist Talk. My name is Kelsey Belahowski, and I'm the Learning and Community Engagement Curator at the Vernon Public Art Gallery. And as a cultural institution, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Syilx people. I'd also like to thank Alternatives Funeral and Cremation Services for sponsoring our Artist Talk series. And so tonight I'm happy to introduce to you all Yangbin Park. So Yangbin Park received his BFA in Studio Art in 2011 from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and his MFA in Printmaking in 2013 from the Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Pennsylvania. So he's been actively involved in residencies and workshops internationally and has exhibited his work around the world. Park's inspiration draws from a range of shared visual culture and socially minded references, including but not limited to personal narrative, historical events, local and global phenomena, and contemporary literature. His work examines the intersection of identity, place, and history. So, like I've mentioned before, I will upload this Artist Talk to our YouTube page when all is said and done. So what I'll probably do is I will ask you guys to mute your cameras, or sorry, mute your audio and take off your cameras while Yangbin does his presentation. Then at the Q&A period, we can turn it all back on and have a nice group discussion. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Yangbin, and thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you for your phenomenal introduction. That was wonderful. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And play my file. So before just we dive into my work, I want to briefly talk about myself. I was born and raised in Korea. And later I moved to the US to pursue my art career. And since then, I've been traveling back and forth between Korea and the US. Currently, I'm teaching at Chungnam National University in Korea. And I have an artistic background in diverse visual fields. So in Korea, I studied fiber and material studies, and I learned to develop a kinship with fiber materials and paper. And also I learned to work with different materials and to solve problems from various angles. And this deeply instilled in me the freedom of using all manner of materials in my artistic practice, embracing well-rounded ways of working. I also learned about paper making and screen printing, which still play an essential role in my art making. I think that my initial background in these particular fields is noteworthy because it laid the cornerstone of my formative years as an artist and emboldened me to have no hesitance in working with materials that are considered less conventional in the field of printmaking. And in Chicago, my practice focused on drawing and abstraction. I was influenced by the Chicago Imagists, working with Jim Nutt, Barbara Rossi, and Richard Hall. And this is one of Jim Nutt's paintings. And this one is done by Richard Hall. And this work is done by Barbara Rossi. And these artists were my teachers at the Art Institute of Chicago. Motivated by urban landscapes and contemporary literatures, I explored imaginary spaces and dreams. Around this time, I began to see the possibilities of incorporating printmaking into my art practice. I saw printmaking not as a means of merely reproducing the same image, but rather as a creative process to make art, a process that informed me of new ideas and paths. As a student from Korea, looking for opportunities, I frequently moved from one place to another. One day I was in Seoul, the next day in New York, then in Chicago, and later in Philadelphia. All this happened in the space of a few years and disoriented my sense of place. And this led me to explore the idea of place, resulting in a series of works interpreting home as a relational space, shifting, changing, and essentially temporary. And USPS, so it is one of the first projects that I created in this context. It addresses this idea of transition and migration based on my personal experience of moving. The USPS series consists of the enlarged self-addressed shipping labels printed on the cardboard shipping boxes that had traveled with me many times during my moves in the United States. The defaced and damaged shipping labels allude to the troubles of being shipped from place to place. These shipping materials and postal labels became both indispensable and emblematic in my life. I think that I was projecting my own uncertain status of being an international student and newcomer in the country. At this point, my artistic interests and themes had changed drastically from abstraction to what I thought to be personal and socially minded work. The central theme in my work became the idea of identity and place. I believe that moving to the United States profoundly affected how I interpreted the concept of home and raised many questions regarding the relationship between identity and place. My endeavor to resolve these questions resulted in a series of works that examined the concept of home. I continued to develop this idea of place as something very personal and historical. I further explored the idea of being in transit, but from a different angle. Through the project titled Ghost Boxes, I intended to convey the physical presence of these shipping boxes that occupy space. This idea oriented from my experience of living with stacks of boxes in my place. My frequent moving induced me to only open boxes that contain things that I was sure about using now and left the rest of the boxes unopened and stacked. I created these piles of shipping boxes with silver foil papers and fake labels with that image in mind. I wanted to create packages that cannot be shipped, that would you like to stay. It was a passive gesture of resistance and turning a means of shipping into something static and standstill. First and foremost, I wanted to please myself. This experience of transforming burdensome objects into something pleasant to look at was surprisingly healing. The best space to install this piece is with transparent walls that allow natural light to come through, as seen in this documentation. As time passes, the light changes and casts shadows, becoming a landscape. The following work is titled Taboo. This piece conveys a cultural transition from one country to another. I think that knowing a piece of background information can shed some light on this piece. In Korean culture, you don't write a person's name in red color unless the person is dead. But in America, writing a person's name in red color means, I guess, more visibility. One thing for sure, it doesn't symbolize death. One day, I picked up my package at the school's desk and found my name written in red color on the label. Even though I understood it was nothing uncommon here, but that didn't prevent me from feeling strange about it. It took me some time to mull over the subtle implications of cultural transition regarding what is acceptable and taboo in different culture. I deliberately created 4 pieces of this print in black frames, reminiscent of the typical portrait of the diseases in Korea. Number 4 is associated with death in some countries in East Asia, including Korea. And these are the most recent prints I made. In a way, I'm going back to this idea of moving. I created these prints right before the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were exhibited at International Print Center, New York, as an online exhibition. And in this pandemic context, this work became quite relevant as it addresses the idea of rejection, the idea of immobilities between countries and borders. Many years of schooling deeply etched the notion of a book as an arbiter of knowledge in my mind. In fact, at school, I was taught to worship book. As a young student, I wasn't allowed to question what books told me. A book projected absolute authority, and spoiling it was a sin deserving punishment. In retrospect, it was understandable because there was no internet, and a book was the primary, if not only, source of information at the time. In this project, I intentionally arranged the various books that allude to possibilities of multiple versions of stories. For example, there is a history told by governments, institutions, and individuals according to their accounts. While working on this work, I was aware that the Korean government actively interfered with the history textbook according to its political interest. And later, I learned that almost all countries do this to various degrees. We are so prone to center ourselves while marginalizing others, and many history books in particular reflect that. By altering the book covers of the original books in graphic, size, and perspective, attempted to draw the viewer's attention to the manipulations of the books. The juxtaposition shows how these neighboring books covers imply an alternative way of thinking regarding how we interact with a book. Above all, it was an experiment to reestablish the relationship between a viewer and an author. In this space, the books are no longer a subject of study, but an object of beholding. Thereby, you are invited to walk around and contemplating on them. And these are a few original etching prints that I created for this project. While living in the States, after trying lots of different things, I became under pressure to find something that as a Korean artist, can talk about. And that brought me back to my childhood home in Seoul in 1988. The project, Documentary, Diary, and Dream, examines how a historical event forms collective identities and affects individuals' lived experience at large. I recollected my childhood memory of the 1988 Seoul Olympics, a significant event that transformed post-war Korean society forever. I demonstrate this transformative period by presenting a domestic space, a recreated version of my childhood home. In this cramped house, my families lived together, and as far as I remember, that was not uncommon in the late 80s in Korea. In the space, blankets, a calendar, photographs, and a jumchi quilt, among other household objects, are juxtaposed. in a broader political context in and around the year 1988. And jumchi is a labor-intensive traditional Korean papermaking technique in which multiple mulberry papers are hand squeezed together to break down the fiber, then melded into a new usable fiber. Once dried, they become very resilient and can be used to make paper clothing and products. For me, jumchi was a perfect physical metaphor for expressing this time of transition and expansion, embodying the collective identities that hover between the post-Korean War society and Korea's desire to present itself as a first world country. I think that living away from home many years, I wanted to revisit my cultural origin in search of genuine expressions of my identity, using a historical event and a place that held significance from my childhood in Korea as a point of departure. I responded to my feelings of displacement. I intended to activate this place as a juncture at which my cultural identity, the historical event, and my home could be intermingled. This established the connection between me and a particular space and time. The project, Documentary Diary and Dream, reflects my feeling about the end of the military regime in Korea in 1988. Perhaps this is why, despite everything, it feels overly optimistic, and perhaps because I was one of the kids born in 1981, the Hodori. And we are looking at the athletes from Soviet Union, and the 1988 Games was the last Olympic game the Soviet Union participated as Soviet Union. As we know, in the following year, in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed and Soviet Union faded into history. Returning to South Korea instigated new topics in my art, which was a current issue. From December 2016 and January 2018, Korea underwent one of the most tumultuous periods in modern history. There was a war crisis between North Korea and the United States, and the impeachment of the South Korean president for the first time in history, and the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics that dramatically eased the tension. I wanted to document the series of events that deeply affected the lives of people living in Korea during this time. Perhaps for those who lived far away from Korea, this was distant international news, but it was a vivid reality for me that felt like riding on a crazed roller coaster. And these are the prints I created from the news articles. This is the installation view at the gallery. I'm interested in investigating how much of an impact political conditions and global power structure can have on individuals' lives. In the project, I intended to focus on the fact that numerous people's lives can be affected and determined by a small number of men in power. Through my work, I collected things, letters, objects, articles, and documentation that testify and archive what I saw and what I heard every day from December 2016 to January 2018. The project Neighborhood Collection sheds light on the global phenomena of rapid disintegrations of small towns through a community in Siningdong, Korea. I moved into the studio sitting in the middle of the area when I began my 2-year-long residency program in 2017. As I explored the neighborhood, I began to notice that dozens of stores had been abandoned and more stores continued to disappear as the economy shrank and people moved out. The town's changing landscape is deeply rooted in the history and recent phenomena of the city's redevelopment plan, which resulted in massive gentrification and exodus, and witnessing how abruptly people's favorite mom and pop stores could vanish as if they never existed, convinced me to create the work. The issue of the shrinking communities concerns today's economic hardship at large and affects us personally. It induces us to think about how this rapid redevelopment constantly shapes and reshapes the way in which we live. And this is the structure. It's motivated by one of the stores that disappeared during my residency. It is crucial to examine local narratives and phenomena as they manifest the microcosm of a much larger society. What was happening in this town is concurrently experienced by diverse communities and cities across the globe. And I constructed this store installation as a memorial to the beloved stores and places that vanished. I intended to empower the neighbors who withstand the odds and display humble resiliency, and activating this space as an engaging and spirited gathering site. And these images of advertisement posters came from the stores in the neighborhood, usually small businesses that sells food and things. And this is the 5,000 paper cup that I created. And these cups were distributed to a local cafe. And in a way, they become a circulating art piece. So when customer buys coffee, their coffee is delivered in this cup, and customer takes these cups to another city, to another place, and it automatically circulates the images of this neighborhood. And this was the cafe, it's coffee shop in the neighborhood. And it is very close to the residence place, just 3 minutes on foot. And the man on the left is the coffee shop owner, and the other people were, I guess, customers. And also I did a few printmaking workshops with the resident. I wanted to invite them to engage this art making process. And I believe that when you have a good understanding of the medium, you can pay more attention to work as well. And they created whatever they wanted to create with their original image or designs. So I just advised the technical aspects of printmaking. I helped them print on the materials they brought. And this zine consists of prints from my 2-year-long exploration of Sinungdong, this area. The images exhibit the changing landscape of the community amidst a rapid transformation, alluding to the local narratives poised by a new development plan, the cycle of creation and extinction. Simultaneously, this community, poignant reminder of small towns disintegration in Korea, reveals our neighbors' resiliency and their unyielding will of life that continues to exist. So this piece is more of documentation than interpretation. And I had a small exhibition with this print. This is a map as a diagram of the community. I created this personalized map filled with interest, affection, and attention, hoping to alleviate the tension and mend emotional scars. And I printed the limited edition of 200, and these prints were distributed to the local residents. After exploring the towns in and out, I created this drawing from my memory and imagination, embracing change and improvisation as a means to envision space and form. I drew inspiration from the history of topography, the urban landscape, and the narrative of the places. This imaginary map suggests the neighborhood as an open and connected space rather than showing accurate territorial borders. The map of Sinung serves to make an intimate relationship with the community. And I envisioned this piece as a public art in the form of billboard, but I couldn't find the right location. So in the end, we decided to install this piece on the wall of our residency building. And this is the final installation of the work. And finally, the piece that is exhibited in our Triennial. In 2019, I had an opportunity to collaborate with Isol Kim, a novelist who wrote the novel 나쁜 피, which is translated as Bad Blood. What interested me in the story was the idea of place associated with the characters' situations, which aligns with my own interest in identity and place. And I took inspiration from a riverside area that conjures up the location depicted in the novel. In a reflection of the protagonist who strives to overcome her unfortunate destiny by transforming a conventional family structure into a new family form, I attempted to deconstruct pre-existing landscapes to construct a new reality. I created a space where a landscape becomes fluid, shifting, and ever changing like water, which does not have a fixed structure. In the interpretation of conceptual transformation, I improvised the whole process of making these screen prints. Without having a predetermined end, I spontaneously disassembled the images documented from the location into fragments. Then I reassembled them in a juxtaposition of aquatic elements, multi-directional shapes, and the urban landscape. The construction and deconstruction process through analog and digital methods resulted in images that explore the intersection of desire, place, and origin. So this was a documentation from the exhibition in Korea. And the piece of writing is the new work written by Ether based on the images that I created after reading her book. So it was a collaboration between an artist and a writer. And thank you. I'm gonna stop share.
Awesome, thank you so much. So the floor is open if anybody has any questions or comments. Well, I personally thought it was interesting how you went from sort of the topography maps that you had drawn, and then you went into this sort of like taking an image of a place and deconstructing it, and then just like another way to kind of visually represent a place, and totally different, but still kind of the same. So anyways, I'm perplexed and interested by that. Not a question, but a comment.
Yeah, this is a kind of behind a story, but in the novel, there is a depiction of this riverside area, but the novel itself never specified which river it is. So it is just a river in general. And looking for image sources, I was exploring many places that has a river. And I found this place. It's called Dorimcheon, the picture I showed. And I took lots of photos, and many of the images actually originated from that place. And later, Ether and I kind of talked about our own process, and we just realized that we were referring to the same river in her novel and in my print, although we never actually discussed it. So that was a very magical moment. So Ether was inspired by the same river that inspired me.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That was very interesting. I just found the river. I had images from the novel, and the river is not really like magnificent, like grandiose river. It's very small and it's shallow, and also it's so close to our residential area. So you can see this complex of apartment, and it used to like divide two areas. So two areas facing the river, but one was like less developed and poor, and the place crossing the river, across the river, was like rapidly transforming into urban town. So that shows the divides and gaps, and that was interesting, just excellent.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed seeing the trajectory of your work, where you started with abstraction and then you've come back to abstraction. And I was wondering if, having gone through this period of making very specific images of these specific places and your experiences, if that changes the way that you look at the abstractions you did at the beginning of your career, now that you're back with abstraction.
You know, I think that we have like our interests always somewhere in our body and in our brain. They sometimes go like dormant, like inactive period. And at a certain point, we kind of revisit our old ideas too. So they, in a way, never dies. It's just dormant and sleeping. And when something ignites you, ignites new interest, like we kind of revisit and retrieve our old ideas. And literature is a very special inspiration for me because it doesn't provide us with a direct visual reference, it is only provided with text. So that really sparks the imagination and creativity that gives me more space to interpret the way I want. And I'm trying to be always like loyal to my feeling. So when I'm compelled to work on certain idea, then I just do without hesitation. I try not to deceive myself, and I try not to do anything unless I'm compelled, because I know that if I force myself to do it, it's not going to create something worth. And that's what I learned from my experience and this trajectory of 12 years of work.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah. I can say that I've seen it quite in some of your work. I've seen some similarities with Luke's works. Luke's were talking about disappeared species, and we're talking about disappearing society or piece of society,
right?
A model of life. So there's a link between that in the idea of disappearing things, and it was very interesting to see that could be interesting. And I will say you're pretty young. You will come back to your old idea very often in your career. We always turn around. I often say that the artistic career is not a line, it's a spiral. And we turn around and we turn around and go, and I think we go closer to ourselves at the end, of course. But you will redo and redo and redo what you are doing when you were very young. So.
I believe so. I really believe in what you said, and I personally I'm very affected by the location I'm living in. So the transition from the work I created in the US to the work I create in Korea also shows that how different places changed the trajectory of my work. That sometimes that also makes me to explore new ideas that I never explored in the past. That gives me another opportunity to create something new rather than repeating myself. But as you said, at a certain point, we just revisit, we make a circle, but it's not the same repetition, but we add new elements to it when we reach the old place, because we have new perspective and new experience gained in the past. So it becomes additional work rather than the repetition of the past work we did.
Yeah,
I think. Thank you for your commentation.
Thank
you. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah, anything about art, about life, about the weather. You're invited to ask any question you have about my travel or anything.
I have a question. Do you ever make art just for the sake of doing something and later find that it has relevance that it has relevance that you were unaware of at the time of the making? Just doing for the joy of doing. And then it reflects a period in your life or that slice of life that is revealed later.
That's an interesting question. I think that I don't necessarily understand everything I do at the time of making. I don't really understand. I do understand a few things, but later, more often than not, I discover new things that I wasn't aware of the time of production.
Mm-hmm.
And later, I really fully grasped what it was.
Yes.
And also making art sometimes, actually pretty often, isn't necessarily like joyful. Sometimes it's it feels like work sometimes, to be honest. It's not like always, to me, like joyful and enjoyable fun. So that that is one of the things. So I think that I really need this strong urge to make art that compels me, that gives me a reason to do it. But as you said, you know, I'm an artist, I'm a maker, and I do find joy in making things and discovering new things and understanding myself better.
Yes.
Through this artistic activity. But I know that I don't necessarily understand everything I do at the time. And later I come to realization why I did that and this.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. That's encouraging.
Right. Yeah.
I was really interested also in your works where you were talking about the Korean paper making process. Can you remind me what that was called again?
Jumchi. Yeah, jumchi.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and so did you go through the process of making paper yourself and then printing on that paper that you had made, or?
Right. So the jumchi blanket was basically quilt. So I got mulberry papers and to make a jumchi, you have to really create this strong tension and frictions of cotton-based paper. So it's a mulberry or Korean paper, Japanese paper that can be working with water. And when they are really like loved strongly against one another, the fiber become really strongly entangled together. And once dry, it almost acts as a piece of fabric rather than a piece of paper. And so you can create like clothes, fiber, products, or craft. And I learned that like after Korean War, the Korea was really poor, in poverty, and people like made things out of necessity and using this paper to create like fabric products. And it's a very labor intensive work. It takes at least 20 to 30 minutes to create this small piece of fabric, because you have to love it many times, like many times. It's a very boring and tedious work. But it embodies this transformation from something being junk to something being very useful.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to have to do some more research.
And also to answer your question, I dyed. I used the natural pigment to dye. So I boiled water, I put this powder of pigment, and then the piece of jumchi. And after 5 minutes, you put it out and it is dyed. So I made a lithography, print on Korean paper, and then I stitched the lithograph onto the jumchi fabric. So summer prints, or combination of these multiple processes, hybrid processes.
Mm-hmm. You stitched the lithograph onto the paper.
Right. I stitched the lithograph onto the jumchi, and quilt I just hand stitched so many pieces of the fabrics that I create. Also, I put some junk fabric and piece of like newsprint and papers, thin fabric and strings in between the mulberry papers. So when you create in this way, you can see through the junks material you embedded in the paper, and it is just present there.
Yes.
So in a way, you can create like more things by putting more junks, like newsprint or piece of fabric or strings and etc.
Within the paper.
Yeah, within the paper, it's embedded.
Yes.
It's a really personalized paper in a way. Yeah, but it's not an ideal paper for conventional print because it has this embossing. It's more than embossing. It has really wild textures. Yes. That is really flat. And to print a fine print, you need to have smooth surface. Yes. So it's not recommended for like conventional like print, like etching, you know, anything. But it's more like experimental work. But but you can find use depending on your intention and work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well.
Wow, it's already 11:50 here.
Yeah.
7:50.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your artistic process and your work with us. It was great to have you, especially with the time change. I'm sure it was a little bit more difficult on your end, so we really appreciate. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was really amazing time talking with you, and it's always great joy to meet new people, even if it is online. But yes, this is new normal, and we are getting really accustomed to this new setting and way of knowing others.
It's true. Well, if you ever come to Canada, you're more than welcome to come over and say yes.
I will. And that is on my bucket list after pandemic.
That's good to know.
List.
Great.
Okay.
Well, we'll have this uploaded to YouTube, so feel free to share it with anybody you might think is interested. And next week, same time, same day on the Tuesday, we have Guy Langevin talking about his work. So feel free to come back for that.
Oh, okay. I will. I'm very excited
Great.
about attending his talk.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thank you for coming today, and have a great, wonderful day.
And you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.